Okay, good afternoon, guys. I see several of my students here that I haven't seen in quite a while. The lecture was originally intended. Does everyone have a handout, by the way? You do. The lecture was originally intended just for my students, and it was just for my students, not because I wanted to give them an advantage, but precisely because of the opposite. It's because I'm never quite able to finish the religion classes during the semester as all my students do. That's why I have to go over it with them one more time. So it was originally intended just for them, but for those people who have had other common professors, I'm sure you guys have gone over the religion classes. Is this correct? You've gone over both, right, and all of it. Okay. This might just serve as sort of a convenient refresher for you. My students that are essentially new. Along the way, there might be some slight differences from what your common law professor told you about the clauses, but essentially it would be the same interpretation, I trust. Okay. Remember that under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, there are actually two clauses that deal with religion. And all of this is in your outline. There's no notes for you to take, really. If you want to make little side notes on the margins, that's okay. But everything I'm about to say is actually in the outline that I provided for you. There are two clauses in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution which deal with the right of religion. The first is called the Free Exercise Clause, and the second is called the Establishment Clause. The Free Exercise Clause, which I abbreviated in the outline as FEC, the Free Exercise Clause, it says that Congress shall not abridge the free exercise of religion. Congress shall not abridge the free exercise of religion. And you notice it says Congress. So it looks like on its face that it would not cover state and local governments. But later on, I'll explain how the U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted the free exercise clause to do so. The second thing is something called the Establishment Clause. And this says that Congress may not establish a religion. Pretty straightforward. And again, it says Congress. Later on, the U.S. Supreme Court has extended that idea of Congress to state and local governments as well, which I'll get to. But there's two of them. Now, if you have, I'm first going to go over the free exercise clause issue, and then I'm going to go over the establishment clause issue. With regard to the free exercise issue, when we talk about state and local governments, here's what I want you to keep in mind. If the state law is regulating religion, you're going to apply something called the Smith test. Smith, like an S-M-I-T-H, Smith test. If the state or local government law regulates religion, and you want to see whether that law violates the free exercise clause, you're going to apply something called the Smith test. Smith test, in theory, is very, very straightforward. Very easy to understand in the abstract. And here's what it says. If that law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, you're going to apply rational review and you're going to let that law pass. If that law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, you're going to apply rational review and you're going to let that law pass. Very straightforward. Now, like I said, the free exercise clause says that Congress may not abridge the right of religious free exercise, but here's what you do if you have an essay question on the bar exam. The very first thing you do if you have a state law question on the bar exam, an essay question, is you say the following. The free exercise clause prohibits Congress from infringing a person's right of religious free exercise. Now, if the state or local government passed that law, here's what you say next. You say that if the state or local government passed it under Cantwell versus Connecticut, the U.S. Supreme Court applied the free exercise clause to the states and local governments. If the state or local law, if you're having a state or local law in the bar exam and you want to see whether it violates the free exercise clause, you say that the Supreme Court has extended the free exercise clause under Cantwell versus Connecticut to apply to state and local governments. Does everyone understand that? It's just boilerplate for you to memorize and spit back out on the bar exam. Now, let me explain exactly how Smith works. Like I said, under the Smith test, if you have a state or local law which treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, you're going to apply rational review and you're going to let that law pass. You are not going to give that law a hard time. You're going to let that law pass if that law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same. So what does it mean to treat religious people and non-religious people exactly the same? Let's take a look at a couple of different examples there. The first example, this is something that comes up that seems like every 3 years in some state criminal court. You have this person named Judge who believes that Satan commanded him to kill people. Satan, kind of like some religious deity, which commanded him to kill people. let's say Florida has a law which prohibits murder. It doesn't care whether you're killing people because Satan or God told you to do so, or simply because you're doing it out of revenge. What happens with regard to Ted? Is he going to be able to invoke his First Amendment right of religious free exercise to get out of jail? Or does that prohibition against murder, does it apply to religious people and non-religious people exactly the same? What do you think? It applies to them exactly the same, and here's why. Killing another human being, unless there's proper self-defense, it can in theory constitute murder, and that rule applies to both religious people and non-religious people exactly the same. It makes no difference what their motivations were. Whether it's an angry husband or an angry God, it makes no difference. The law is exactly the same for both parties. It will be subject to rational review. And if it's subject to rational review, vanilla, conventional rational review, it's going to pass. Does everyone understand that? Very straightforward. This is another example here. Ignore the second example for now. Let's go to the third example. You have Kara, who's a high priestess of a religion that requires new members to pay for sex with Kara in order to retain membership. This is actually a true case from Broward County. Kara is prosecuted for prostitution. May she overturn her conviction as a violation of the free exercise clause? Of course she cannot do so. The prohibition against prostitution applies to everyone, not just to religionists. The next example, you have the IRS. If they, as everyone knows, the Internal Revenue Service gives charitable exemptions for all sorts of different organizations. But if the IRS decides at one point, oh, we're just going to give charitable exemptions for non-religious charities, and we're not going to give them to religious charities, that will clearly not be treating religious people and non-religious people exactly the same. Does everyone understand that? Let me repeat that one more time. The IRS, as everyone knows, it gives exemptions for charity groups. So like non-religious charities, the American Red Cross, for example, is not formally affiliated with any religious group. They get certain tax exemptions. But Catholic Services always also gets tax exemptions as well for the charity work that they do. Now, if that federal law were changed, and only something like the Red Cross, a secular group, will get the exemption, but not something like Catholic Services will get the exemption, then you have a law which is not treating them exactly the same. Does everyone see that? That's going to be subject to strict scrutiny, and almost for sure that's going to be struck down. Everyone understand that? Because it's not treating them exactly the same. Next example, you have a law which defines marriage as between one man and one woman. This is actually in the Florida Constitution, for those of you who are unaware. The Florida Constitution defines marriage as between one man and one woman. And let's say, for example, there's some fringe Mormon group, and it wants to permit its members, it wants to encourage or even demand its members to marry in polygamous conditions. So it requires its members to marry more than one person, like to have multiple partners in the marriage ceremony. Can that Mormon group make the argument that that state definition of marriage should be subject to something that's like strict scrutiny? Or is that law treating religious people and non-religious people exactly the same? What do you think? Exactly the same, and here's why. It doesn't matter whether God is telling you that you have to marry more than one person, or whether you just want to because you're in love with more than one person. Everyone is treated exactly the same under that law, and it will be treated under rational review. Everyone understands? Very straightforward, yes? Okay. The Smith case, and let me just go into that. The reason I'm saving this until later is because I thought going through the examples would actually be a little bit more efficient for you. I usually did not do that. I would tell you about the case first, but I want to go through the examples first, and now I'll tell you about the case, about the Smith case. Does everyone in the class, by the way, are you aware of the Smith case? Let me know if you actually know of the case. Smith versus Oregon Employment Commission. Yes?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay, Brian knows a little bit of it. Okay, good. That's good. It's all I have. Let me go ahead and give you a quick rundown on it. And this was the test which established this idea that if a state law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, it will be subject to rational review. This was the case that brought that about. Happened in the early 1990s, 1991, I believe. These were the facts. You had Mr. Smith. He was a member of the Native American Church in Oregon. And as the membership in the Native American Church requires, at least his group, they require that he smoke peyote as part of their Native American traditions. This is what their Native American gods require them to smoke peyote and reflect upon the meaning of their religion. Oregon has a criminal prohibition against the use of peyote. You are not permitted to use peyote in the state of Oregon. It's a criminal offense. Now, Mr. Smith, he smokes the peyote. He doesn't get caught though, but his employer finds out about what he did, and he's eventually fired. Now, his employer is not any ordinary employer. Mr. Smith works as a drug rehab counselor in Oregon, and his employer finds out that he had just violated one of the state criminal prohibitions against drug use by smoking peyote. He finds out and he's fired. Mr. Smith then goes to an employment division in Oregon and asks the employment division for some type of compensation because he was fired. The employment division asked him, "So Mr. Smith, why were you fired?" "I willfully violated a criminal law in our state against the smoking of peyote. That's why I was fired. May I get my unemployment check, please?" And they said, "Yeah, we don't reward criminals. If you were fired because you committed a crime, we can't give you money for that." He sued the state of Oregon Employment Division saying, "You need to give me money for that because my God told me to do so. Don't blame me, blame my God." That was his argument. The case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Remember the Oregon Employment Division's policy. If you commit a crime and that's why you were fired, I cannot cut you a check for being unemployed. Does that law treat religious people and non-religious people exactly the same? It does. Because instead of smoking peyote because your God told you to, what if you intentionally beat someone up, committed assault and battery? You still cannot get a check if your employer finds out. What if you were a police officer and you beat someone up and the police department fired you? They're not going to cut you a check for violating the law. Does everyone understand that? So that's why it's subject to rational review. Just keep that in mind. If you have a state or a local law and it treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, it will always be subject to rational review, and it will always pass that rational review. Very straightforward. Okay. There's one case though that one sort of, a couple of exceptions to that I'll go over that you should keep in mind. One thing is, even if you have a law which on its face appears to be treating religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, sometimes if the motivation for that law is based on a hatred against a religious group, that law can still be struck down. Let me repeat that. Even if you have a state or local law which treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, if the motivation behind that law was to discriminate against religious people or a particular religious group, that law can still be struck down under strict scrutiny. Does everyone understand? I'll give you an example. This is from Hialeah. Hialeah, Brian knows this case, obviously. He knows from his extracurricular endeavors. City of Hialeah versus Church of the Lakumi Babaluai. These were the facts there. The city of Hialeah, in the city of Hialeah at this time, there's a group called the Church of the Lakumi, and they practice something called the Santeria religion. It's a form, at least the way I understand it, it's a form of Haitian voodoo. And they're practicing this religion. What's problematic though is that, at least in this particular way in which the members of this group is practicing it, it involves animal sacrifice. So they meet in someone's backyard in Hialeah on a weekend, and then they bring these animals with them. They're usually doves and goats. They bring them to the backyard, they're alive at that point. And then some chanting will occur, and at that point, a priest will start taking a knife and slowly cutting the necks off the goat and the doves. The people who live next to this house are getting very, very concerned because they can hear their animals crying out for life. A bleating goat crying out for its desperate life, watching its blood ooze down its neck. And when they look in the backyard, as they peek over it, they can see blood all over the backyard and like sacrificed animals everywhere. Very, very disturbing in the eyes of the neighbors. They contact City Hall and they pressure City Hall to pass a law to prevent them from doing this. Now, on the face of the law, it looks like it's treating religious people and non-religious people exactly the same. But there's a little bit in which the language is a little bit off. Part of the law says that no one can commit animal sacrifice unless they've been given a license to work in a butchery. No one can commit animal sacrifice unless they've been given a license to do so by the state, usually in the form of something like a butchery. But the motivation behind the law was to discriminate against the Santa Ria religion, because in another part of the statute, what it says is that no one can commit any law for the purpose, no one can permit animal sacrifice also for purposes of religious sacrifice. No one can kill an animal for the purposes of religious sacrifice. And the Supreme Court thought that, and plus some of the speeches that had been given by the city mayor, led the Supreme Court to believe that the real purpose behind the law was to discriminate against a particular group. What I'm trying to say is the following. If you see a law which might be on its face okay, but if the motivation behind the law is to discriminate against a particular group, you should apply strict scrutiny to that particular law, because the real purpose of that law is to discriminate against a particular religious group. Everyone understand? So far we've been talking about state and local laws. What happens if you have a law which is passed by the federal government? If it's a law passed by the federal government, even if it treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, it may still violate the free exercise clause. If the law is passed by the federal government and it treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, it may still violate the free exercise clause. And here's why. The Smith case, it basically changed the U.S. Supreme Court's understanding of the free exercise clause only with respect to state and local governments. Only with respect to state and local governments. Only with respect to state and local governments, and no one else. That means that with federal governments, they're still bound by the test that came before Smith in the 1990s. The federal government is bound by a test that came before Smith in the 1990s. Now, this test that came before Smith in the 1990s, this is actually called the undue burden test. Undue burden test. And the undue burden test is really hard to master. Very complicated, lots of strange exceptions. But the rule of thumb with the undue burden test that you should know is as follows. If you have a federal law which presents an undue burden on a religious person, that law will be subject to strict scrutiny, even if it treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same. If you have a federal law which presents an undue burden on a religious person, that law will be subject to strict scrutiny, even if it treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same. The question is, what constitutes an undue burden? This is a very difficult question to answer because there's so many strange examples in the U.S. Supreme Court that don't quite fit together into a coherent end. But keep the following in mind. As long as you can make the argument that that federal law forces a person to choose between his religion and legal punishment, at that point, it can, in theory, constitute an undue burden. If that law forces a religious person to choose between her God and the law in a way that's coercive, it may constitute an undue burden. If you have a law which forces a person to choose between her God and legal punishment in a coercive manner, it may constitute an undue burden, and then you're going to apply strict scrutiny. The most famous example of that came up this year is the famous Hobby Lobby case, for those of you who are aware. Are you guys aware of that, the Hobby Lobby case? The Affordable Care Act, sometimes known as the Obamacare Act, it required private employers to provide health insurance. And under the Affordable Care Act, private companies were required to provide contraceptives to their employees. Hobby Lobby is a chain of kind of merchandise stores. It's a little knickknacks and things like frames and such. Hobby Lobby is a privately owned company. It's owned by a Christian family. It's not a publicly trading company like Microsoft or something like that. It's a privately held company owned by a Christian family, and they don't want to provide their employees services for contraceptives. They don't want to provide health insurance that's going to cover contraceptives. Because according to that Christian family, that's a sin against God. To find means to stifle human reproduction. This is, in the Christian family's perspective, a sin against God, so that they don't want to do this. The problem is that if they don't do this, they're going to be subject to certain penalties under the Affordable Care Act. The case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and remember that definition I gave you about what's an undue burden? If you force someone, including a corporation, to choose between their God and legal punishment in a coercive manner, that's going to be an undue burden. So Hobby Lobby made the following argument. Your Honor, the Affordable Care Act is forcing me to choose between my Christian God and financial punishment. I feel I'm coerced to choose the insurance in violation of what God wants me to do. That's not fair. Because either way, I lose out in a big way. I have to pay huge fines to the federal government, or I have to violate what God tells me to do. That's an undue burden on my faith as a Christian. And the court said, I agree with that. I think that's an undue burden for you to share. The amount of money you have to pay in order to comply with your God, the government is making you choose. You're going to choose your God, or you're going to choose me. Because I'll punish you if you don't choose me. That's not right. The punishment is too severe, and the court agreed with Hobby Lobby. If you see a situation like that, that's an undue burden, okay? Keep that in mind. So remember, if you have a state or a local law, and it treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, you're going to apply rational review under the Smith test. But if you have a federal law, even though it treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, it may still violate the free exercise clause if it presents an undue burden on that person's religious beliefs. Does everyone understand that? Okay. I said that I would talk about a couple of exceptions with regard to the Smith test. If you have a law which treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, what to do. A couple of exceptions to keep in mind. I know that in the Smith test, Mr. Smith, he applied for unemployment benefits and he was not given an unemployment check because he violated a criminal law. But what if he had a religious guy who quit his job, not because he violated a criminal law, but just because, boss, I can't do this. It violates what God tells me to do. So he quits that job and then he wants an unemployment check. Can he get that? According to the U.S. Supreme Court, if that guy, he can show that there was an undue burden presented against him with regard to his religious beliefs, and that's why he had to quit his job, then he's entitled to a check from the employment division in the state. If that guy can show, this is all on your outline, if that guy can show that he suffered an undue burden between doing his job and obeying his God, and that's why he quit, then he can get an unemployment check. And I'll give you the facts of what I'm talking about. This is Thomas versus Review Board. Eddie Thomas is a Jehovah's Witness. He works in a factory that cuts steel sheeting. These are large sheets of steel that he's responsible for cutting. I guess this huge machinery which cuts these sheets of steel. He's happy with his job. He does not have a problem. But one day, his supervisor tells him, Eddie, come here. We got enough guys cutting the steel. I want you to move up to the assembly line over there. You're going to be part of another crew. They're going to take that steel, they're going to roll it like this. They're going to roll it like this into a tube, okay? I want you to, we got enough guys cutting right now. We need more rollers. So then you go join that crew over there, they're going to help them roll the sheet, okay? So he says, no problem, boss. But when he goes over there, he notices what they're doing. They're rolling the sheet into this large tube. It's like half of this table over here, and they're rolling into a huge tube like this. And they say, what is this tube used for? It's going to serve as a turret on a tank that's going to blow people to a billion pieces. You know, I'm a Jehovah's Witness. My God tells me that I cannot help people engage in war. I can't, this is like a giant gun. This is actually worse than a gun. My God tells me I can't do this. And the tricky thing is there are actually other Jehovah's Witnesses on that same factory line who are doing the same thing. They say, I'm not killing anyone. I'm not killing anyone. I'm just like rolling this thing. That's all I'm doing. So they don't have a problem, but Eddie does. I'm going to come back to that issue in just 1 second, but he has a problem with this. He tells his boss, can I go back to the cutting and rolling? And he says, what difference does it make? You cut it over there, it's going to end up over there. What difference does that make? What makes a difference to me? Because I don't want to, that rolling part changes everything for me. I don't want to do that. And that also creates a situation for the court later. I'll return to this also, but he says, it's a different, the sheeting, the cut I can do, I can't, this makes a difference to me. And then the supervisor says, you see them other guys over there, aren't they your Jehovah's Witnesses friends who go to that church with you? Yes? They don't have a problem, right? No? But you do. Yes? Clear out your law again. So he's fired. He says he's not going to go back and do this, and there's not enough spaces for him to cut it. So since he's not going to go back and do this, we won't be draining one. We got other guys in line. We don't need draining one. So he says, you want to go back? No. Then you're going to be fired. Well, I don't want to do that. Okay, then you're gone. Okay, fine. So he leaves, and he tries to get a check from an unemployment division, and they ask him, why did you, did you commit a crime? It's not a crime to refuse to work at a factory. No, I did not commit a crime. So then why did you quit? Because my God tells me I can't do this. And this is where all the trouble begins, because when they interview us, your boss says that there were other Jehovah's Witnesses who did not have a problem. Is this true? Yeah, that's true. But you do. Yeah. Is this some official church line? No. It's just my understanding of my Jehovah's Witness God. So this is not some official church line. No, it's just my Eddie Thomas's view of Jehovah's Witness religion. And you're comfortable with cutting it, but 5 minutes later you're uncomfortable with rolling it. That's right. I'm not going to give a check to you because this sounds screwy to me. I don't even think you're a Jehovah's Witness. It doesn't even make any sense to me. You're uncomfortable. You're okay with cutting it, but you can't roll it. And there are other Jehovah's Witnesses who can do this, but you know what? I'm not going to take your check. The case goes before the U.S. Supreme Court. Chief Justice Berger, keep this following in mind when you think about, you might have a scenario in which some guy has a religious belief which is totally unlike everyone else who says he believes the same thing. Chief Justice Berger writes a majority opinion and says, I know that to other people who are not Eddie Thomas, that they don't understand the distinction between cutting the sheet and rolling it. You look at that and you think it's just one same thing. And there are other Jehovah's Witnesses working down that line, and they don't have a problem with that. I know it looks strange, but it's not for me or anyone else on this earth to tell Eddie how to obey his Jehovah's Witness God, including other Jehovah's Witnesses. If he believes it this way, that's the way he's entitled to believe it, and I can't question that because I'm not God. Does anyone understand that? That's a huge statement from the court, because you see what Berger is doing. He's saying that the very nature of the divine, we don't know what's right or wrong. Maybe he is talking with Eddie. You got any proof that he's not talking to him? Maybe he is. I don't know. And Berger goes a long way. If you have a bar scenario in which you have something like all the other Christians, they don't have a problem with it, but there's that one Christian who says, I don't think that's what God wants me to do. Make sure you keep that in mind. The court is very sympathetic to an individual having an extremely idiosyncratic and eccentric understanding of his religion, even though other people don't really get it, including people as members of his own flock. Keep that in mind, okay? The other thing I want you to keep in mind for employment division versus Smith is the following. Even though that law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, remember what the law is. The employment division, this one in Indiana, not Oregon, this one in Indiana, they said that, like, if your boss is asking you to do something and it's within his legal rights to ask you to do this and you don't want to do it and then you're fired, he's not doing it because of your religion, he's just doing it because you don't want to work there. So instead of saying, I don't want to work there because, boss, I mean, it's harder to like do this and like just cut it. I'm like, I'm just kind of tired. And then he fires you. You ain't gonna get it. You ain't gonna get it either according to that employment division policy. And here's what the court says: if the guy says that for his religion he cannot do a particular job and he wants unemployment benefits, I want you to look at the undue burden and not just look at whether the law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same. If he wants money from the employment division, and he has not committed a crime, I want you to go back to that old undue burden test and not look at whether the law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same. Does everyone understand that? If the guy wants money from an employment division, don't use does the law treat religious people and non-religious people exactly the same. Instead, I want you to use the undue burden test. Is it an undue burden for Eddie to choose between his Jehovah's Witness God and then rolling the sheet and to steal into the turret? Use the undue burden test. And here's why you have the exception.
That's for state law too? That's not in my...
It's for state law too, Brian.
Okay.
It's for state law too. And here's why. Unemployment benefits, as long as the guy has not committed a crime like Smith, unemployment benefits, they too close to your human being. You need that to eat and feed your family. That's why the court says we ain't gonna say that as long as the law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, the law is going to be subject to rational review. With regard to unemployment benefits, as long as the man has not committed a crime, he needs that money to feed himself and feed his family. That's why we're going to apply undue burden on that. Just for that, though. Everyone understand that? Just for that. If it ain't for that, we're going to say if it treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, we're going to apply rational review. But for unemployment benefits, we're going to apply the undue burden test. Instead of asking the question, so if you did not roll the turf because you did not like working with that crew, or you think it's harder because, or you don't like the amount of money you get because it's too low, and then you're fired, that law would seem to apply to religious people and non-religious people exactly the same. It seems like it would be subject to rational review, but the court said, with regard to unemployment benefits, we ain't gonna do that. We're gonna do the undue burden test. Because unemployment benefits, they're too important for a human being to live. Does everyone understand that? That's one exception you've gotta keep in mind. It's too important for a human being to live. Now, if you kill someone because God tells you to, and that boy kills that other person because he's angry at him because he cheated with his ex-girlfriend, that's another story. That law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, and you both going to be subject to the same punishment. The law is going to be subject to rational review. But with regard to unemployment benefits, as long as you did not commit a crime, we're going to apply the undue burden test because unemployment benefits are truly essential for a human being to survive. Everyone got that? Okay. The other exception I want you to keep in mind. Is this. There's something called a hybrid case. Hybrid case. This is Yoder versus Wisconsin. Hybrid case. Generally, if you have a state law which treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, you're going to apply rational review, not the undue burden test. But there's two exceptions. One is the unemployment benefits. We just talked about that. The other is something called a hybrid case. Hybrid case concerns the following. If you have a religious person saying that this violates his religious beliefs under the undue burden test, plus it violates some other constitutional right, at that point, he can probably win the case. If that person makes the argument that it violates his beliefs under the undue burden test, and it violates some other constitutional right, then he can probably win the case and have the law be subject to strict scrutiny. If you have a person making the argument that the state law presents an undue burden, and that the state law also violates another constitutional right, then the state law will be subject to strict scrutiny and probably be struck down. If you have a person making the argument that the state law presents an undue burden, and also violates some other constitutional right, probably that law will be subject to strict scrutiny, and it'll be struck down. Here's the example I want to give you. Yoder versus Wisconsin. Wisconsin had a law which applies to religious people and non-religious people exactly the same. So here's where you get the hybrid case. This is the law. Up to a certain number of years, up to a certain year, every single parent in the state of Wisconsin had to send their child to either a public school or a publicly accredited private school. Every single parent had to send their child, I think to age 12, to a public school or a publicly accredited private school. Mr. Yoder belongs to something called the Old Order Amish religion. He does not want to send his kids to a public school or a publicly accredited private school. What he wants to do is he wants to keep his son in the Amish community, in Wisconsin, in a rural community. For those of you who are unaware of what an Amish community is, traditional Amish community, there's no electricity there. It's kind of an exaggeration because many of them do, but there's supposed to be no electricity there. They drive horse and buggy. This is also kind of an exaggeration because many of them do in fact have cars, but horse and buggy, no electricity, very plain clothes, very rural community, and their entire economy is formed around farming. And they're supposed to intermarry each other as well, sort of a much older ancient community. Mr. Yoder does not want his boy to go to a public school for the following reason. If his son goes to a public school, he'll meet people like in this room. And then his brain will get all crazy. And he'll never want to go back to the Amish community ever again. He'll want to stay here at St. Thomas, hang out with you guys, smoke in the breezeway, and so on, and just hang out. And little Ezekiel is never going to go back to the Amish community. And so that's going to be the problem. And so what Mr. Yoder wants to do is he wants to keep his son in the Amish community. That's going to be in violation of the Wisconsin law, though. The Wisconsin law, does it treat religious people and non-religious people exactly the same?
Yes.
Up to age 12, you gotta come. And if you don't, I'm gonna arrest your mom. Does it treat religious people and non-religious people exactly the same? It does, right? Mr. Yoder, he's gonna make the following argument. Even though that law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, Your Honor, it's an undue burden to me. It's an undue burden to me. I know it treats us religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, but it's an undue burden to me. And specifically, this, you forcing me to choose between my Amish God and going to jail. That is coercive, Your Honor. How can Wisconsin tell me, if you want to obey your Amish God, why don't you obey him in prison? You can do that too. Your Honor, they're forcing me to make an impossible choice. This is coercive in nature. It's an undue burden. Mr. Yoder also made another argument. Plus one more thing, Your Honor. Under the 14th Amendment Liberty Clause interest, the 14th Amendment says that no state, including Wisconsin, shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Under that Liberty Clause interest, Your Honor, there is a right of parents to teach their children about their family values and religious values. It's like Meyer versus Nebraska, for those of you who still remember that case. Pierce versus Society of Sisters. They have a right to be able to do this. Mr. Yoder essentially made a hybrid argument. On the one, he said, half of my argument, Your Honor, is as follows. That law is forcing me to do something impossible. Choose between your God or whether you want to go to prison. That's an impossible choice for me, Your Honor. And then on top of that, I have a right as a parent to teach my kids as I see fit, not as the government sees fit. I'm going to combine these two rights, make it a hybrid situation, and of course, I like that hybrid situation. So this hybrid situation is going to work as well. If the person can show that it's an undue burden on him, plus find himself another constitutional right, add that up, he's going to be able to show that it violates his religious beliefs as well. Everyone understand? Okay, good. Let me stop there, see if there are any questions before we get to the Establishment Clause.
I mean, you don't think you could have just won on the argument that it violated his right to rear his children out of police by itself?
Good question, Max. Part of the creepiness, the awkwardness of the reasoning, this hybrid, anytime someone brings up hybrid, I become immediately suspicious and think there's something kind of sort of silly going on, and there's someone wants something desperately, and that's why they're going to make up these arguments. That case was decided, I believe, in 1974. After 1974, after Smith had come around in the early 1990s, 1991 or 1990, after that had happened, the Supreme Court is stuck in a situation where they had never overruled Yoder versus Wisconsin, but they've had Smith on their hands. You got a perfectly respectable law which treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same. Why don't you apply rational review then, just like Smith tell you to overturn that case, but Supreme Court never overturned it. How are you going to make that fit then if you're never going to overturn that case? Well, that was different because we got a little hybrid action going on there, and they just kind of made it up. Does that make sense? Okay. So there was a lot of Supreme Court cases, unlike perhaps some property cases that like Barbara teaches, most Supreme Court cases are based on guys sitting around a poker table and without any clear plan about what's happening and thinking like, how are we gonna just make something up? Just make it up. Rational review with bite, hybrid scenarios, intermediate review with bite. This is stuff. These are people who are trying to like explain things in their past which make no sense to their mature lives and trying to explain them away. Constitutional law is pockmarked by all sorts of like nutty situations and grown up trying to explain things that they did when they were teenagers, which were reckless and strange. The Establishment Clause says the following: it says Congress may not establish a religion. Congress may not establish a religion. If you have a state or local, law, first of all, go ahead and recite the Establishment Clause. It says Congress may not establish a religion or prefer religion over non-religion. Go ahead and recite that. But then say that Everson versus School Board 1947, it extended the Establishment Clause to cover state and local laws as well. Everson versus School Board 1947, it extended the Establishment Clause to apply to state and local laws as well. The Establishment Clause in some ways is more frustrating than the Free Exercise Clause because the court actually has a couple of different tests for it. And you kind of wonder, like, which test is it using these days? This is somewhat difficult to say, but the test that the court has come back to over and over again, and the only test that I really think you need to know for the bar exam, and the reason I can say that with some confidence is that I also lecture for Barbary, and the only test that we emphasize for the Establishment Clause is the Lemon test. There are other tests too, but Barbary does not emphasize the other test. Barbary does not even mention the other test. And as one of the lectures for Barbary, I don't do that either. It's basically the lemon test that you need to know. The lemon test that applies to a case called Lemon versus Kurtzman. It was decided in 1971. The three parts to the lemon test. Three parts to the lemon test. And in order for a law not to violate the Establishment Clause, it has to satisfy all three of these different requirements. So here are the three different requirements. Again, all three of the requirements must be satisfied in order for a law not to violate the Establishment Clause. The law must have a secular purpose. Number two, the law's primary effect must neither advance nor inhibit religion. Or another way of saying that is that the law must have a secular effect. Number three, the law must not excessively entangle government and religion. All three of these have to be met in order for the law not to violate the Establishment Clause. If all three of these things are met, you're going to play rational review again. You've got to let that law go. Let's talk about these three different things and how they might sort of manifest themselves. Number one, not a secular purpose. A law that requires every public school classroom to post the 10 Commandments. There's no secular purpose behind that. There's no secular purpose behind that. There's some schools in Kentucky that have done that, in some public schools that have posted the 10 Commandments, and the attorney for the public school is trying to get away with it by saying the following. And it's very very sort of like relevant for a state like Kentucky. Myself having lived there for 2 years, the lawyer for, and not Louisville, but like rural Kentucky, I lived there 2 years. The Kentucky's lawyer said the following: Your Honor, how can you accuse us of trying to spread Christian religion by putting up the 10 Commandments in the public schools? Those 10 Commandments are things that any human being should want to know, regardless of his or her religion or lack thereof. Don't kill people. Is that a Christian belief, Your Honor? I don't think so. That was the argument that the attorney for Kentucky offered. But the judge came back by saying, the federal judge came back by saying, Counselor, back up. He said, and one more thing, Your Honor, cheating on your wife, is that? Yeah, I get it. I know that's not, I understand where it's going. Well, like, coveting thy neighbors, I understand. I understand that people who are not Christian also want to, I get it. But this is the thing. If the crux of your argument is that those are not inherently Christian values, but there are values that any secular-minded, any atheist person who's morally informed should want to adopt, if that's your view, why don't you just say, don't steal your neighbor's property and don't kill people and put that out? Instead of saying, the Lord commanded you to obey these 10 commandments. Why do you do that? Why don't you just put them up in like secular thing, don't cheat on your wife? Well, what difference does it make, Your Honor? I mean, God or not, I'm just saying, and basically the court said, if they're not really that big of a, just take God out of it then. And don't call it the 10 Commandments from God to Moses to us. Just say, don't do these things as a good person. And then, well, we don't want to do that, Your Honor. And see, there was no secular purpose behind that. Does everyone see this? Even if the government were to make the argument that, what about any morally informed person? Would you like to covet thy neighbor's wife? Is that what you're all about, you atheists? No atheist will want to do this. Even if you can make that argument, it still does not somehow satisfy the secular effect argument. Watch for that on the bar exam. Just because a clever lawyer for the religious group, for the government to say that, there's also a secular purpose behind it. That's not going to save it. Keep that in mind, okay? If it seems like the main effect is for the religion, that's not going to. The lawyer can't save it by saying that there's also a secular purpose to this as well. Second example, a law requiring teachers to hold a 1-minute session during class prayer or meditation by students. This also came up in the U.S. Supreme Court. The court struck it down. There's no secular purpose behind this. There was a school in Rhode Island, a public school, that said, we're going to have a little time out for reflection or prayer. And this is exactly what the school teacher said for the Christian students in Rhode Island. We ask that you take 5 minutes and reflect and pray to your God. And for the heathens, for the non-religious students, we ask that you use that as an opportunity to reflect upon life. The court struck that down and said there is no secular purpose behind that. But the lawyer for the public schools, again, no, we said that the heathen children can also, pray to their rock or, whatever. We said that. We said that. So there was like, or like, think about, committing crimes or whatever, non-Christian children do. We said that there are opportunities to do other things. But again, we're struck that, watch this. This is the same thing that the Kentucky lawyer did, saying that there's also a secular purpose behind this, Your Honor. Does that make sense? That's never going to fly. If it seems like, well, I mean, why even have something like this? Why not just say it's quiet time, just take some time. Everyone remembers from elementary school, you had nap time. It's quiet time, very important for little children to have nap time, for the teacher to kind of relax and have like a cigarette while the kids are asleep. Very important. Now, why don't you just have like a secular quiet time? Instead of doing that, it was religion or secular, and that's what blew it for the government lawyers, because the insertion of the word religion. Is it religion, or what do people want to do over there? I mean, that's what blew it. That's what blew it. Always, if you're the government lawyer, don't like flip that way. Always say it's just quiet time. That's all. I mean, we're not even going to use that word, but using words like that, it'll poison the whole thing. A drop of gasoline in a barrel of very expensive wine is just going to ruin the entire thing. So be careful of that. Third example, a law requiring public school teachers to teach creation science, the theory that there is scientific proof for the existence of a higher being. If the teachers also teach biological evolution, same problem. Does everyone see the pattern here? This happened in a couple of schools, Alabama, Mississippi, Kansas. The school had this policy that we're going to teach creation science. For those of you who don't know what creation science is, in a nutshell, this is what the theory is. Because our chemistry, because the physical properties which put together me, you, everyone in this room, this dust, this universe, everything, I mean, like, how could it come by accident? It can't. Like, someone has to be like, pulling the strings on all this to like put this together, and that someone, my friend, is God. Okay, so that's creation science. Some schools in Kansas and Alabama and Louisiana are teaching this, but again, they do the following. This is for the Christian good children, and for the heathen students, they are going to teach biology. Okay, let's go learn biology. Okay, but for the Christian children, we're going to learn about God's word and how He may be responsible for putting all of this together in the way that He had designed. So again, they have this alternative where say one way is going to be for those children, the good Christian children, and the other is for the people who want to learn biology and so on in the other room. That's not going to fly. There's no secular effect behind that. You see this pattern going on. That's how the state is trying to have its cake and eat it too. They can never do that. They can never say, how could you say there's no secular effect behind what we're doing? We're providing alternatives. We're letting the students choose, Ron. What are we doing wrong? What you're doing wrong is you're using taxpayer money to establish your religious belief. That's not going to work. Watch for that trick being played by the government over and over again. And then we talked about the Ten Commandments already. This is in the county courthouse. Same problem, of course. Second one, what is a secular purpose? Let's take a look at McGowan versus Maryland in 1961. You had a law requiring businesses to close on Sundays. The Supreme Court concluded that the law's origins were in Christianity, but the Supreme Court also said that the main purpose was to give people a day of rest, and the idea of giving merchants a day of rest on Sunday was widely accepted and then transcended its religious affiliation, meaning lots of people who aren't Christian want a Sunday day of rest too. Basically what's going on back here is that everyone knows some cities, some states apparently like Maryland, some cities for sure though, they have laws which require, not just permit, but requires stores to close on Sundays. And here's why. They require them to close on Sundays because if they open on Sundays, it requires more cops to patrol that area. And the city does not have the money or does not want to use this money to like pay those cops. The other thing is that there might be too much congestion in that part of downtown. I'm thinking like places like Ann Arbor, which are like little college towns, but there could be tons of congestion in the downtown area at that time. To cut down on congestion and to avoid paying for cops, the city may require that all the stores be closed on Sunday. Someone, however, may make the argument, why not Saturday? Why Sunday? They're both weekends. You chose Sunday because that's a traditional Christian day of rest. That violates the Establishment Clause, which says that state and local governments and Congress cannot establish religion. You just did. That violates the Establishment Clause. But in Maryland versus McGowan, here's what the Supreme Court said. First of all, It is true that Sunday is a day of rest for Christian people. That part's true. But many of y'all who don't even go to church spend Sunday off. You watch your football games, drink beer, hang out with your friends. You take that day off as though you were a Christian and you know you ain't. And this is the second part the court came up with. First, the widespread level of agreement among people over time to want to do this, but also they said this. Over time, even people who weren't Christian, they just accepted it. They just accepted it over time. Two factors to look for when the court is willing to look away. If enough people now accept it as a non-religious day, then it probably have a secular purpose. If enough people now accept it as a secular day, it probably have a secular purpose. Second thing is, if there's a long tradition behind people having accepted it as a secular day, it probably have a secular purpose. Everyone see this? Keep that in mind. So if people are kind of used to doing this, it could be okay. If you have a Christmas tree, like on City Hall, and it's been happening in Bowling Green, Kentucky for past 70 years, and people are Christian or non-Christian, they just love seeing that tree. It's part of the traditions of that city. The court might look away and say, a lot of people in Bowling Green, they accept that tree now as not necessarily being Christian per se, part of the identity of Bowling Green, Kentucky. And it's been happening for 7 years, and people seem to have been good with that. Does everyone see this? Now, if it was like a Christian cross, that would be something different, but Christmas tree, Saint Nick, Santa Claus, not exactly totally related to the Christian religion. Everyone loves, who doesn't love Santa Claus? Everybody loves Santa Claus. Not exactly a religious figure like Jesus Christ. So look for how many people accept it today and how long that tradition has been going on with the acquiescence of the community at large. Primary effect, this is next part. Primary effect must neither advance nor inhibit religion, must have a secular effect. What does it mean to advance religion? A law prohibited any employer from requiring her employer to employer from prohibiting her employee, requiring her employee to work on the employee's Sabbath. The Supreme Court said it violated the establishment clause because the primary effect was to advance religion at the expense of non-religion. Atheists or agnostics, they don't have the legal right to be exempted and work this way. This is a little bit different. If you have a law which prohibited any employer from requiring her employee to work on the Sabbath, people who don't have a religion, they can't get the benefit of that. Like if someone who's an atheist, what religion do you obey, son? I don't believe in God, sir. So our Christian, Muslim, and Jewish friends have a Sabbath, but you don't believe in God, is that right? No, sir. I guess you ain't gonna get no Sabbath then. You're gonna have to work every single day of the week. The court said that's establishing religion because people who are religious get that benefit, and people who are not religious don't get that benefit. Does everyone see this? That's not right. You have to treat people with a rough equality in that way. That's why that Sunday closing, everybody benefits from that. Christian, non-Christian, atheist, agnostic, you name it, everyone benefits from Sunday. Who does not want a Sunday off? You don't have to be Christian to appreciate that. Has a secular effect. A federal law prohibits discrimination by private employers against employers because of the latter's religion. The law permits one exception though, keep the following in mind guys. Religious groups may discriminate in their hiring in terms of the employer's religion. According to the Catholic Church, only men can become priests at this time. If someone who's a female decides to sue the Catholic Church for violating relevant civil rights laws against gender discrimination, she's not going to win. She's not going to win because there's an exemption for religious groups with regard to hiring their own employees with regard to inherently religious responsibilities, like being a priest, for example. Plus, that exemption, that also does not violate the Establishment Clause. Even though that treats religious people and non-religious people differently, the Supreme Court is of the view that that is something that churches are entitled to, because if they don't give churches that exemption, do you see the other problem? We violate the Free Exercise Clause. Because you're telling the people, oh, you don't want to hire a female as your priest? How about if I put the archbishop in jail? You're forcing the archbishop to choose between his religion and going to prison. And that violates that person's Free Exercise Clause beliefs. Does everyone see this? So there's this middle ground where it's a safe zone between Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause. Excessive entanglement. Okay, this is the most aggravating part of teaching establishment clause. Because this is excessive entanglement just makes no sense to me calling up professors about why do some people say this is excessive entanglement in this situation and not other times. It's just so weird. But I've tried to come up with sort of a broad sort of understanding. Numerous Supreme Court cases have held that the federal government violates the establishment clause when it gives funding to parochial schools, that's religious schools, to teach religion. But so too when the parochial school teaches non-religious subjects like math. Why? Because the government would have to monitor the school to see whether it's using the money to teach religious or non-religious subjects. That's entangling itself. Another way of thinking about that is the following. If the government gives money to a church or some religious organization like a Catholic school, if it gives them money, one question is that school might use, or that church might use some of that money for purely religious purposes. And then the government has to go over there and monitor that church to see whether, or that school to see whether they're using that money for like religious purposes, or like, just like paying for lunches, or like, books on like math or something like that. That's a problem because then you have some guy working for the state government who becomes the most high-ranking priest in that church by figuring out how the money can be used for which religious purposes or not. In other words, you have a government official deciding what the meaning of that church is. Does everyone understand this? That's an excessive entanglement where the government has to decide, oh, you can use it for this religious purpose, but not for that religious purpose. It effectively turns that government official into a full-time member of that church. That's too much excessive entanglement between the government and the church. You can't have that. That essentially ends the lecture there. Let me see if you guys have any questions.
Just have one regarding the reading of the Bible for a non-secular purpose, like history or anything like that in the public schools, okay?
That's
as long as it's not a permanent curriculum, like daily, years long, or posted 365.
Oh, great question. The question was asked, reading the Bible. If it's reading the Bible for purposes other than praise or indoctrination, it's always okay. So like as a matter of like anthropology or literature, always okay. But if you're reading it for the purposes of praise or indoctrination, that's a totally religious purpose behind it. All right, guys, good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.